Yo, what's up, y'all? Today we're getting into this book. It's called The New Jim Crow, okay? By Michelle Alexander, with a new forum by Cornell West. You see that? All right. Mass incarceration in the age of color blindness. Now, what I will say about this is, a lot of our brothers and sisters are getting locked up behind just doing stupid stuff. I understand that a lot of things that people are locked up for could be nonsense, but we have to be very careful that we don't make a simple mistake, even though nobody's perfect. But at the same time, us as black people, you have to really be careful out there because they will throw the book at you in a heartbeat. And this is what this is all about. It's a well-known fact that white people get less time for the same crimes that are committed by white and black individuals. So, say for instance, a black person has a murder case and a white person has a murder case, that white person is known to get less time. Same thing with drug dealers and so on and so forth. So let's get right into this. Okay, we're gonna go to the form. Let's start with the introduction. Okay. Jarvis Cotton cannot vote like his father, his grandfather, and his great-grandfather, and his great-great-grandfather. He has been denied the right to practice in our electoral democracy. Cotton's family tree tells the story of several generations of black men who were born in the U.S. but who were denied the most basic freedom of democracy promises, the freedom to vote for those who will make the rules and laws that govern one's life. Okay, Cotton's great-great-grandfather could not vote as a slave. His great-grandfather was beaten to death by the Ku Klux Klan for attempting to vote. Wow, that's sad. His grandfather was prevented from voting by the Klan intimidation. Ku Klux Klan, man, that's crazy, man. His father was barred from voting by poll taxes and literacy tests. Today, Jarvis Cotton cannot vote because he, like many black men in the U.S., has been labeled a felon and is currently on parole. Well, one day we have to find out what Jarvis Cotton did. Okay, Cotton's story illustrates, in many respects, the old adage. Okay, the more things change, the more they remain the same. In each generation, new tactics have been used to achieve the same goals shared by the founding fathers. Denying African American citizenship was deemed essential to the formation of the original union. Yeah, see, that's why we need to change their original union. See, we're still living by those tactics, where black people was a certain fourth of a person, only a certain percentage of a person. See, this is the situation we're in right now. We need to change a lot of those the forefathers things that they say. We'll get more into that, Declaration of Independence, Bill of Rights. We get into that. Hundreds of years later, America is still not an egalitarian democracy. The arguments and rationalizations that have been trotted out in support of racial exclusion and discrimination in its various forms have changed and evolved, but the outcome has remained largely the same. An extraordinary percentage of black men in the U.S. are legally barred from voting today. just as they have been throughout most of American history. They are also subject to legalized discrimination, employment, housing, education, public benefits, and jury service, just as their parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents once were. What has changed since the class of Jim Crow has less to be with the basic structure of our society than with the language we use to justify it. In the era of colored blindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race publicly as a justification of discrimination, okay? Exclusion and social contempt. So we don't, rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all practices we supposedly left behind. Today is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the way that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, denial of education opportunities, denial of food stamps, and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service are suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. Okay. I reached the conclusion presented in the book reluctantly 10 years ago. I would have argued strenuously against the central claim made here, namely that something akin to a racial caste system currently exists in the U.S. Indeed, if Barack Obama has been elected president back then, I would have argued that his election marked the national triumph over racial caste, the final nail in the coffin of Jim Crow. My elation would have been tempered by the distance yet to travel to each the promised land of racial justice in America, but my conviction that nothing remotely similar to Jim Crow exists in the country would have been steadfast. Today, my elation over Obama's election is tempered by the far more sobering awareness. As an African American woman, the 3 young children who will never know a world in which black men could not be president of the United States, I was beyond thrilled on election night. Yet when I walked out of the election night party full of hope and enthusiasm, I was immediately remembered of the harsh realities of the new Jim Crow. A black man was on his knees in the gutter, hands cuffed behind his back, as several police officers stood around him talking, joking, and ignoring his human existence. people poured out of the building. Many stared for a moment at the black man cowering in the streets, and then averted their gaze. What did election of Barack Obama mean for this? Like many civil rights lawyers, I was inspired to attend law school by the civil rights victories of 1950s and the 1960s, even in the face of growing social and political opposition, remedial politics such as affirmative action. I clung to the notion that the evils of Jim Crow are behind us, and that while we have a long way to go to fulfill the dreams of an egalitarian, multiracial democracy, we have made real progress and are now struggling to hold on to the gains of the past. I thought my job as a civil rights lawyer was to join with the allies of racial progress to resist attacks on affirmative action and to eliminate the vestiges of Jim Crow segregation. Work with me on these words, y'all. I'm not a perfect reader, but it's all good. You get where I'm going, including our still separated and unequal system of education. I understand the problems plaguing poor communities of color, including problems associated with crime and rising incarceration rates, to be a function of poverty and lack of access to quality education and continuing legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Never did I seriously consider the possibility that a new racial caste system was operating in this country. The new system has been developed and implemented swiftly, and it was largely invisible, even to people like me, who spend most of their walking hours fighting for justice. I mean, I agree with that. I agree that, a lot of the times, people in poor communities, whether it be white or black, but mostly black communities, don't have as much opportunity, man. So they're out there selling drugs. They see selling drugs and certain things as the only way out, I mean, they shouldn't turn to that. But what you going to do if you 9, 10, 11, 12 and you're poor and you don't got nothing and you're living in the ghetto, in the projects, in the hood, and all you have is drug addicts and everything around you, I mean, yeah, you don't have to choose that life, but what else do they have hope for doing now? That is their parents' fault. Their parents have to be on the grind and get to the money and try to be able to support their child and get them keep food and stuff in their mouth closed on their back. But a lot of them can't keep food in their mouth closed on their back. So, a lot of these poor people are going out doing what they have to do in order to eat and to put nice things on their back. Okay, I first encountered the idea of new racial caste system more than a decade ago, when a bright orange poster caught my eye. I was rushed to catch the bus. I noticed a sign stapled to a telephone pole that screamed in large bold letters, "The drug war is the new Jim Crow." I paused for a moment and skimmed the text of the flyer. Some racial group was holding a community meeting about police brutality and new 3-strike law in California and expansion of American prison systems. The meeting was being held at a small community church a few blocks away. It had seating capacity for no more than 50 people. I sighed and muttered to myself something like, yeah, the criminal justice system is racist in many ways, but it really doesn't help to make such a absurd comparisons. People will just think you're crazy and then cross the street. And I hopped on the bus. I headed back to my new job, director of the Racial Justice Project of the American Civil Liberty Union, the ACLU, in North California. So Yeah. So when I began to work at the ACLU, I assumed that the criminal justice system had problems for racial bias, such in a way, same way that all major institutions in our society are plagued with problems associated with conscious and unconscious bias. As a lawyer who had litigation, numerous class actions, employment discrimination cases, I understood well the many ways in which racial stereotyping can permeate subjective decision making processes at all levels of an organization with devastating consequences. I was familiar with the challenges associated with Reformation institution in which racial stratification is thought to be normal. The normal consequences of differences in education, culture, motivation, and some still believe innate ability. While the ACLU, I shifted I shifted my focus from employment discrimination to criminal justice reform and dedicated myself to the task of working with others to identify and eliminate racial bias whenever and wherever it reared its ugly head. By the time I left the ACLU, I had come to suspect that I was wrong about the criminal justice system. It was not just another institution infected with racial bias, but rather a different beast entirely. The activists who posted the sign on telephone poles were not crazy, nor were the smattering of lawyers and advocates around the country who were beginning to connect the dots between our current system of mass incarceration and earlier forms of social control. Quietly, belatedly, I came to see that mass incarceration in the U.S. had in fact emerged as a stunningly comprehensive and well disguised system of racialized social control that function in a manner strikingly similar to Jim Crow. In my experiences, people who have been incarcerated really have difficulty identifying the parallels between their system of social control. Once they are released, they are often denied the right to vote, excluded from juries, and relegated to a racial segregated and subordinate existence through a web of laws, regulations, and informal rules, all of which are powerfully reinforced by social stigma. They are confined to the margins of mainstream society and deny access to the mainstream economy. Okay. They are legally denied the ability to obtain employment, housing, and public benefits, such as African Americans were once forced into segregated second-class citizens in the Jim Crow era. Those of us who have viewed that form from a comfortable distance, yet sympathize with the plight of the so-called underclass, tend to interpret the experience of those caught up in the social justice system, primarily thought through the lens of popularized social science, attributing the staggering increase of incarceration rates in communities of color by the predictable through unfortunate consequences of poverty, racial segregation, unequal education opportunities, and presumed realities of the drug market, including the mistaken belief that most drug dealers are black and or brown. Occasionally, in the course of work, someone would make a remark suggesting that perhaps the war on drugs is a racial conspiracy to put black men in their place. This type of remark was invariably accomplished by nervous laughter, intended to convey the impression that although ideas had crossed their minds, it was not an idea a reasonable person would make seriously. Most people assumed the war on drugs was launched in response to the crisis caused by crack cocaine in the inner city neighborhoods. They viewed codes that the racial disparities in drug convictions and sentences, as well as rapid explosions of prison population, reflected nothing more than the government's zealous but benign efforts to address rampant drug crime in poor minority neighborhoods. This view, while understandable given the sensational media coverage of crack in the 1980s and 1990s, is simply wrong. Okay, so y'all know this is going on, so y'all gotta be careful out there while y'all selling dope and stuff, because you know they after you. Okay, while it is true that the publicity surrounding crack cocaine led to a dramatic increase in finding the drug war, as well as to sentence policies that greatly exacerbated racial disparities in incarceration rates. There is no truth to the notion that the war on drugs has launched in response to crack cocaine. President Ronald Reagan officially announced the current drug war in 1982, before crack became an issue in the media or a crisis in poor black neighborhoods. A few years after the drug war was declared, crack began to spread rapidly in the poor black neighborhoods in Los Angeles and later emerged in the cities across the country. The Reagan administration hired staff to publicize the emergence of crack cocaine in 1985 as part of a strategy effort to build public and legislative support for the war. The media campaign was an extraordinary success. Almost overnight, the media was saturated with images of black crack whores, crack dealers, and crack babies. Images that seemed to confirm the worst negative racial stereotype about impoverished inner city residents. The media bonanza surrounded the new demon drug helped to catapult the war on drugs from an ambitious federal policy to an actual war. Okay, the timing of crack crisis helped to fuel conspiracies, theories, and general speculations in poor black communities that the war on drugs are part of a genocidal plan by the government to destroy black people in the United States. From the outset, stories circulated on the street that crack and other drugs were being brought into the black communities by the CIA. That eventually Even the Urban League came to take the claim of genocide seriously. In its 1990 report, The State of Black America, it stated, there is at least one concept that must be recognized if one is to see the pervasive and insidious nature of the drug problem from African American communities. Though difficult to accept, that is the concept of genocide. While the conspiracy theory were initially dismissed as far-fetched, if not downright loony, the word on the street turned out to be right, at least to a point. The CIA administrated in 1990 that guerrilla armies it actively supported in Nicaragua were smuggling illegal drugs into the U.S., drugs that were making their own way onto the streets of inner-city black neighborhoods in the form of crack cocaine. The CIA also admitted that in the midst of the war on drugs, it blocked law enforcement efforts to investigate illegal drug networks that were helping to fund its covert war in Nicaragua. It bears emphasis that the CIA never admitted, nor has any evidence been revealed to support the claim, that it initially sought the destruction of black communities by allowing illegal drugs to be smuggled into the U.S. Nonetheless, conspiracy theories surely must be forgiven for their bold accusations of genocide in the light of devastation wrought by crack cocaine and the drug war, and the odd consequences that an illegal drug crisis suddenly appeared in the black community after, not before, drug war had been declared. In fact, the war on drugs began at a time when illegal drug use was on the decline. During that same time period, however, a war was declared, causing arrests and convictions for drug offenses to skyrocket, especially among people of color. The impact of the drug war has been astounding. In less than 30 years, the U.S. penal population exploded from around 300,000 to more than 2 million, with drug convictions accounting for the majority of the increase. The United States now has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, dwarfing the rates of nearly every developed country, even surpassing in highly repressive regimes like Russia, China, and Iran. In Germany, 93 people are in prison for every 100,000 adults and children. In the United States, the rate is roughly 8 times that, or 850 per 100,000. The racial dimension of mass incarceration is its most striking feature. No other country in the world imprisons so many of its racial and ethnic minorities. The U.S. imprisons a large percentage of its black population than South Africa did at the height of apartheid. And in Washington, D.C., our national capital, is estimated that 3 out of 4 black men and nearly all those in poor neighborhoods can expect to serve time in prison. See, this is why you got to be on point and watch what you're doing out there. They already got it out for you, so you got to be careful. Okay, similar rates of incarceration can be found in black communities across America. Okay, the stark racial parties cannot be explained by rates of drug crimes. Studies show that people of all colors use and sell drugs at remarkably similar rates. If there are significant differences in the surveys to be found, they frequently suggest that whites, particularly white youth, are more likely to engage in war crimes than people of color. That is not what one would guess. However, when entering our nation's prisons and jails, which are overflowing with black and brown drug offenders, in some states, black men have been admitted to prison on drug charges at rates 20 to 50 times greater than those of white men. In major cities racked by the drug war, as many of 80% of young African American men now have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. These young men are part of growing, uncast, permanently locked up and locked out of mainstream society. It may be surprising to some that drug crime was declining, not rising. When the drug war was declared from a historical perspective, however, the lack of correlation between crime and punishment is nothing new. Okay, sociologists have frequently observed the government use punishment primarily as a tool of social control, and thus the extent or severity of punishment is often unrelated to actual crime patterns. Michael Torney explains, in Thinking About Crime, governments decided how much punishment they want, and these decisions are in no simple way related to crime rates. This fact, he pointed out, can be seen most clearly by putting crime and punishment in comparative perspective. Although crime rates in the U.S. have not been markedly higher than those of other Western countries, the rate of incarceration has soared in the U.S. while it has remained stable or declined in other countries. Between 1960 and 1990, for example, official crime rates in Finland, Germany, and U.S. were close to identical. Yet the U.S. incarceration rate quadrupled. The Finnish rate fell. The Finnish rate fell by 60%, and the German rate was stable in that period. Despite similar crime rates, each government chose to impose different levels of punishment. Today, due to the recent decline, U.S. crime rates have dipped below the international norm. Nevertheless, the U.S. now boasts an incarceration rate that is 6 to 10 times greater than of other industrialized nations, a development directly traceable on the drug war. The only country in the world that even comes close to American rate of incarceration is Russia. Okay, and no other countries in the world incarcerates such an astonishing percentage of its racial and ethnic minorities. Okay, the stark and sobering reality is that for reasons largely unrelated to actual crime trends, the American penal system has emerged as a system of racial control unparalleled in world history. And while the size of the system alone might suggest that it would touch the lives of most Americans, the primary target of its control can be defined largely by race. This is an astonishing development, especially given that as recently as the mid-1970s, the most well-respected criminologists are predicting that the prison system would soon fade away. Prison did not deter crime significantly. Many experts concluded those who have meaningful economic and social opportunities were unlikely to commit crimes regardless of the penalty. See, when you have meaningful economic and social opportunities, you're unlikely to do those crimes. But when you have nothing and you're stuck, you're going to most likely commit those crimes, especially if you're a product of your environment and that's all everybody else do. Now, you don't have to be a product of your environment. You shouldn't be. You should be smarter than that. But I understand you got to do what you got to do. While those who went to prison were far more likely to commit crimes again in the future. The growing consensus among experts was perhaps best reflected by the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals, which issued a recommendation in 1973 that no new institution of adults should be built and existing institutions for juveniles should be closed. This recommendation was based on their finding that the prison and reformity and the jail have achieved only a shocking record of failure. Okay, there is overwhelming evidence that these institutions create crime rather than prevent it. They said they create it. That's interesting. These days, activists who advocate a world without prison are often dismissed as quacks. But only a few decades ago, the notion that our society would be much better without prisons and that the end of prisons was more or less inevitable not only dominated mainstream academy discourse in the field of criminology, but also inspired a national campaign by reformers demanding a moratorium of prison construction. Now, I don't know if I agree with that, man. You need prison for some people. Some people are just wild and out of control, and they need to be locked up just to sit down and understand the hurt that they cause to other people. Now, but I understand where this is coming from, But, you gotta keep that in mind, too. When people doing wrong to other people, sometimes they need to sit down. Okay, Mark Moore, the executive director of sentencing projects, notes that what is most remarkable about the moratorium campaign in retrospect is the content of imprisonment at the time. In 1973, fewer than 350,000 people were being held in prison and jails worldwide, compared with more than 2 million people today. The rate of incarceration in 1970 was at a level so low that it no longer seemed in the realm of possibility, but for moratorium supporters. All right, the magnitude of imprisonment were very high. Were irregularly high. Supporters of the moratorium effort can be forgotten for being so naive. More suggests since the prison expansion that was about to take place was unprecedented in human history. No one imagined that the prison population would more than quadruple in their lifetime. It seemed far more likely that prisons would fade away. Far from fading away, it appears that prisons are here to stay, and despite the unprecedented level of incarceration in the African American community, the civil rights community is oddly quiet. 1 in 3 African American men will serve time in prison, and current trend continues, and in some cities, more than half of all young black men are currently under correctional control in prisons or in jail, on probation or on parole. Yet mass incarceration tends to be categorized as a criminal justice issue as opposed to racial justice and civil rights issue or crisis. The attention of civil rights advocates have been largely devoted to other issues such as affirmative action. During the past 20 years, virtually every progressive national civil rights organization in the country has mobilized and relied in defense of affirmative action. The struggle to preserve affirmative action in higher education and thus maintain diversity in the nation's most elite colleges and universities has consumed much of the attention and resources of the civil rights communities and dominated racial justice discourse in the mainstream media, leading to the general public to believe that affirmative action is the main battlefront in U.S. race relations, even as our prisons fill with black and brown men. My own experience reflects this dynamic. When I first joined the ACLU, no one imagined that the Racial Justice Project would force its attention on criminal justice reform. The ACL was engaged in important criminal justice reform work, but no one suspected that work would eventually become central to the agenda of Racial Justice Project. The assumption was that the project would concentrate its efforts on defending affirmative action. Shortly after leaving the ACLU, I joined the board of directors of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of San Francisco Bay Area. Although the organization included racial justice among its core priorities, reform of the criminal justice system was not a major part of its racial justice work. It was not alone. Okay, in January 2008, the leadership Conference on Civil Rights, an organization Give me 1 second, y'all. An organization composed of leadership of more than 180 civil rights organizations sent a letter to its allies and supporters informing them of a major initiative to document the voting record of members of Congress. The letter explained that its forthcoming report would show how each representative and senator cast his or her own vote on some of the most important civil rights issues of 2007, including voting rights, affirmative action, immigration, nomination, education, hate crimes, employment, health, housing, and property. Okay. Criminal justice issues did not make the list. Criminal justice issues did not make the list. That same board-based coalition organized a major conference in October 2007, entitled Why We Can't Wait, reversing the retreat of civil rights, which included panel discussing school integration, employment discrimination, housing and lending discrimination, economic justice, environmental justice, disability rights, age discrimination, the immigrants' rights, not illegal. Cornell panel was devoted to criminal justice reform. Not a panel was the elected leaders of the African American communities have a much broader mandate than civil rights groups, but they too frequently overlook criminal justice. In January 2009, for example, the Congressional Black Caucus sent a letter to thousands of community organization leaders, whom have worked with the caucus over the years, soliciting general information about them and requesting that they identify their priorities. More than 35 topics were listed as areas of potential special interest, including taxes, defense, immigration, agriculture, housing, banking, higher education, multimedia, transportation, and infrastructure, women, seniors, nutrition, faith initiatives, civil rights, census, economic security, and emerging leaders. No mention was made of criminal justice. Re-entry was listed, but a community leader who was interested in criminal justice reform had to check the box label other. Okay. This is not to say that important criminal justice reform work has not been done. Our civil rights advocates have organized vigorous challenges to specific aspects of these new caste systems. One notable example is the Success Challenge led by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to a racist drug sting. Oppression in Tulane, Texas. Okay. The 1999 drug bust incarceration included 15% of the black population in the town. I have to go back and check that out. Of the town, based on the uncorroborated false testimony of a single informant hired by the sheriff of Tulane. More recently, civil rights groups around the country have helped to launch legal attacks and vibrant grassroots campaign against felon disenfranchised laws and have strenuously opposed discriminatory crack sentence laws and guidelines, as well as a zero tolerance policy that effectively funnels youth of color from schools to jails. The National ACLU recently developed a racial justice program that includes criminal justice issues among its core priorities and has created a promising drug law reform project. And thanks to the aggressive advocacy of the ACLU, NAACP, and other civil rights organizations around the world, racial profiling is widely condemned even by members of law enforcement who once openly embraced the practice. Still, despite their significant developments, there seems to be a lack of appreciation for the enormity of the crisis at hand. There is no broad-based movement brewing at the end of mass incarceration and no advocacy effort that approaches and scale the fight to preserve affirmative action. They also remain a persistent tendency in the civil rights community to treat the criminal justice system as just another institution infected with lingering racial bias. The NAACP's website offers one example. As recent as May 2008, one could find a brief introduction to the organization's criminal justice work in the section entitled Legal Department. The introduction explains that despite the civil rights victories of our past, racial prejudice still pervades the criminal justice system. Visitors to the website were urged to join the NAACP in order to project the hard-earned criminal rights gain of the past 3 decades. No one visiting the website would learn that the mass incarceration of African Americans had already eviscerated many of the hard-earned gains it urged its members to project. Imagine if civil rights organizations and African American leaders in the 1940s had not placed Jim had not placed Jim Crow segregation at the forefront of their racial justice agenda. It would have seemed absurd, given that the racial segregation was the primary vehicle of rationalized social control in the U.S. during that period. This book argues the massive incarceration is metaphorically the new Jim Crow, and that all those who care about the social justice should fully commit themselves to dismantling the new racial caste system. Mass incarceration, not attacks on affirmative action or lax civil rights enforcement, is the most damaging manifestations of the backlash against the civil rights movement. The popular narrative that emphasizes the death of slavery and Jim Crow and celebrates the national triumph over race with the election of Barack Obama is dangerously misguided. The colorblind public census that prevails in America today, i.e., the widespread belief that race no longer matters has blinded us to the realities of race in our society and facilitated the emerge of a new caste system. Clearly, much has changed in my thinking about the criminal justice system since I passed that bright orange post stapled on the telephone pole 10 years ago. For me, the new caste system is now as obvious as my own face in the mirror. Like an optical illusion, one in which that embedded images is impossible to see until its outline is identified. The new caste system lurks invisible within the maze of rationalizations we have developed for persistent racial inequality. It is possible, quite easy, in fact, never to set the embedded reality. Only after years of working on criminal justice reforms did my own focus finally shift, and then the rigid caste system slowly came into view. Eventually, it became obvious. Now it seems odd that I could not see it before. Knowing as I do the difficulty of seeing what most everyone insists does not exist, I anticipate that this book will be met with skepticism or something worse. For some, the characterizations of mass incarceration as a racial caste system may seem like a gross exaggeration, if not hyperbole. Yes, we may have classes in the U.S. vaguely defined upper, middle, and lower classes, and we may even have a underclass, a group so estranged from mainstream society that it is no longer in reach of the mystical ladder of opportunity, but we do not. Many will insist have anything in this country that resembles a caste. The aim of this book is not to venture into the long-running, vigorous debate and the scholarly literature regarding that does and does not constitute a caste system. I use the term racial caste in this book the way it is used in common parlance to donate and stigmatized racial groups locked into an inferior position by the law and custom. Jim Crow and slavery were caste systems. So, in our current system of mass incarceration, it may be helpful to attempt to understand the basic nature of the new caste system, to think of civil justice system as to think of the criminal justice system, the entire collections of institutions and practices that comprise it, not as a independent system, but rather as a gateway into much larger systems of racial stigmatization and permanent marginalization, with large systems referred to here as massive incarceration, in a system that locks people not only behind bars, actual bars and actual prisons, but also behind virtual bars and virtual walls that are invisible to the naked eye, but functions nearly as effectively as Jim Crow laws once did at locking people of color into a permanent second-class citizenship. The term where mass incarceration refers not only to criminal justice system, but also to a large web of laws, rules, policies, and customs that control these labeled criminals both in and out of prison. Once released, former prisoners enter a hidden underworld of legalized discrimination and permanent social exclusion. They are members of America's new undercaste. The language of caste may well seem foreign or unfamiliar to some. Public discussions about racial caste in America are relatively rare. We avoid talking about caste in our society because we are ashamed of our racial history. We also avoid talking about race. We even avoid talking about class. Conversations about class are resisted in part because there is a tendency to imagine that one's class reflects upon one's character. What is key to America's understanding of class is the persistent belief, despite all the evidence of contrary, that anyone with the proper discipline and drive can move from a lower class to a higher class. We recognize that the mobility may be difficult, but the key to our collective self-image is the assumption that mobility is always possible. So failure to move up reflects on one's character, but extension, the failure of a race and ethnic group to move up reflects very poorly on the group as a whole. So they're saying that you can be poor and move up, and you can. It might be difficult, but you can. You're in an environment that's messed up. Just know that you don't have to choose that route. You don't have to choose that route, even though it might seem like your only route. You need to find a way to make your way out of your situation of lack of resources in poor areas. You need to find a way. Okay. What is completely missed in the rare public debate today about the plight of African Americans is that a large percentage of them are not free to move up at all. It is not just that they lack opportunity, attend poor schools, and are plagued by poverty. They are barred by law from doing so. And the major institutions with which they come into contact are designed to prevent their mobility, to put the matter starkly. The current system of control permanently locks a huge percentage of African American communities out of the mainstream society and economy. The system operates through our criminal justice institutions, but its functions more likely like a caste system than a system of criminal crime control. Viewed from the perspective, the so-called underclass is better understood as an undercaste, a lower caste of individuals who are permanently barred by law and customs from mainstream society. Although this new system is racialized, social control purports to be colorblind. It creates the mainstream's racial hierarchies such as early systems of control did. Like Jim Crow and slavery, mass incarceration operates as a tightly networked system of laws, policies, customs, and institutions that operate collectively to ensure the subordinate status of a group defined largely by race. We're almost there, y'all. Work with me. This is good information, though. Okay? The argument may be particularly hard to swallow given the election of Barack Obama. Many will wonder how a nation that has just elected its first black president could possibly have a social caste system. It is a fair question, but to discuss in Chapter 6, there is no inconsistency, however, between the election of Barack Obama to the highest office in the land and the existence of racial caste systems in the era of colorblind. The current system of control depends on black expectationalism. It is not disapproved or undermined by it. Okay, others may wonder how a racial caste system could exist when most Americans of all color oppose racial discrimination and endorse colorblindness. Yet, as we shall see in the pages that follow, racial caste systems do not require racial hostility or overt bigotry to thrive. They need only racial indifference, as Martin Luther King Jr. warned more than 45 years ago. Okay, so racial indifference. Okay, that's important. The recent decisions by some state legislatures, mostly notably New York's, to repeal or reduce mandatory drug sentences. Laws have led some to believe that the system of racial control described in this book is already fading away. Such a conclusion, I believe, is a serious mistake. Many of the states that have reconsidered their harsh sentences schemes have done so not out of concern for the lives and families that have been destroyed by these laws or the racial dimensions of the drug war. But out of concern for bursting state budgets in a time of economic recession. In other words, the racial ideology that gave rise to these laws remains largely undisturbed. Changing economic conditions or rising crime rates could easily result in a reversal of fortunes for those who committed drug crimes, particularly if the drug criminals were perceived to be black and brown. Equally important to understanding is this merely reduces sentences in length by itself, does not disturb the basic architecture of Jim Crow. So long as long number of African Americans continue to be arrested and labeled drug criminals, they will continue to be relegated to be a permanent second-class status upon their release, no matter how much or how little time they spent behind bars. The system of mass incarceration is based on prison label, not prison time. Skepticism about the claims made here are warranted. They are important endeavors to be sure among mass incarceration, Jim Crow, and slavery, the three major racialized systems of control adopted in the U.S. to date. Failure to acknowledge the relevant differences as well as their implications would be a disservice to racial justice disclosure. Many of the differences are not as dramatic as they initially appear. However, others serve to illustrate the way in which systems of racial social control have managed to morph, evolve, and adapt to changes in the political, social, and legal context over time. Ultimately, I believe that the similarities between these systems of control overwhelm the differences, and that massive incarceration, like its predecessors, have been largely immunized from legal challenge. If this claim is substantially correct, the implications for racial justice advocacy are found. Okay. With the benefit of hindsight, surely we have been the piecemeal policy reform or litigation alone would have been a futile approach to dismantle Jim Crow segregation. While those strategies certainly had their place, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and consummate culture shift would never have occurred within the cultivation of critical political consciousness in the African American community and widespread strategic activism that flow from it. Okay. Likewise, the notion that the new Jim Crow can ever be dismantled through traditional litigation and policy reform strategies that are wholly disconnected from a major social movement seemed fundamentally misjudged. Such a movement is possible, though, if those may commit to abolishing racial hierarchy, continue to talk and behave as if a state-sponsored racial caste system no longer exists. If we continue to tell ourselves the popular myths about racial progress, or worse yet, if we say to ourselves that the problem of mass incarceration is just too big, too daunting for us to do anything about, and that we should instead direct our energies to battle that might be more easier won. History will judge us harshly. A human rights nightmare is occurring on our watch. A new social consensus must be forged about race and the role of race in defining the basic structure of our society. If we hope even to abolish the new Jim Crow, the new consensus must begin with dialogue and conversation that fosters a critical consciousness, a key prerequisite to effective social actions. This book is an attempt to ensure that the conversation does not end with nervous laughter. It is not possible to write a relative short book that explores all aspects of phenomenal mass incarceration and its implications for racial justice. No attempt has been made to do so here. This book paints with a broad brush, and as a result, many important issues have not received the attention they deserve. For example, relatively little is said about the unique experience of women, Latinos, and immigrants in the social system. Through these groups are particularly vulnerable to the worst abuses and suffers in ways that are important and distinct. This book focuses on the experience of African American men in the new caste system. I hope other scholars and advocates will pick up where this book leaves off and develops the criteria more fully and apply the themes sketched here to other groups and other contexts. What this book intends to do, the only thing it is intended to do is to stimulate a such needed conversation about the whole of criminal justice system and creating a perpetuating racial hierarchy in the United States. The fate of millions of people, indeed the future of black communities itself, may develop on the willingness of those who care about the racial justice to re-examine their basic assumptions about the role of the criminal justice system in our society. The fact that more than half of young black men in many large American cities are currently under the control of the criminal justice system or saddled with criminal records is not, as many argue, just a symptom of poverty or poor choices, but rather evidence of a new racial caste system at work. Chapter 1 begins our journey. It briefly reviews the history of racialized social control in the U.S., answering the basic questions: how did we get here? The chapter describes the control of African Americans through racial caste systems such as slavery and Jim Crow, which appear to die but then are reborn in new form. Trailer to the needs and constraints of the time. As well as we shall see, there is a certain pattern to birth and death of racial caste in America. Time and again, the most ardent proponents of racial hierarchy have succeeded in creating new caste systems by triggering a collapse of resistance across the political spectrum. This feat has been achieved largely by appealing to the racial and vulnerability of lower class whites, a group of people who are understandably eager to ensure that they never find themselves trapped at the bottom of the American totem pole. These patterns dating back to slavery have birthed yet another racial caste system in the U.S., mass incarceration. The structure of mass incarceration is described in some detail in chapter 2 with a focus on the war on drugs. Few legal rules meaningfully constrain the police in the drug war, and enormous financial incentives have been granted to law enforcement to engage in massive mass drug arrests through military-style tactics. Once swept into the system, one's chances of ever being truly free are slim, often to the vanishing point. Defendants are typically denied meaningful legal representation, pressured by the threat of lengthy sentences into a plea bargain, and then placed under formal control in prison or jail or probation or parole. Upon release, ex-offenders are discriminated against legally for the rest of their lives, and most will eventually return to prison. They are members of America's new undercast. Institutionalized. Many people will be institutionalized. Chapter 3 turns our attention to the role of race in America's criminal justice system. It describes the method to the madness. How a formerly race-neutral criminal justice system can manage to round up, arrest, and imprison an extremely number of black and brown men when people of color are actually no more likely to be guilty of drug crimes and any other offenses than whites. This chapter debunks the notion that rates of black imprisonment can be explained by the crime rate and identifies the huge racial disparities at every stage of criminal justice process, from the initial stop, search, and arrest to plea, bargaining, and sentence phases. In short, the chapter explains how the legal rules that structure the system guarantee discriminatory results. These legal rules ensure that the undercast is overwhelmingly black and brown. And chapter 4 considers how the caste system operates once people are released from prison. In many respects, release from prison does not represent the beginning of freedom, but instead the cruel new phase of stigmatization and control. Myriad laws, rules, and regulations discriminate many ex-offenders and effectively presents their meaningful reintegration into the mainstream economy and society. I argue that the shame and stigma of the prison labels is, in many respects, more damaging to African American communities than the shame or stigma associations with Jim Crow. The criminalization and demonization of black men have turned the black community against itself, unrevealing communities and family relations, the seemingly networks of maternal support, and intensifying the shame and self-hatred experiences by the current period cast. Okay. This is interesting. The many parallels between mass incarceration and Jim Crow are explored in Chapter 5. The most obvious parallel is legalized discrimination like Jim Crow. Massive incarceration marginalizes large segments of African American communities, segregates them physically in prison, jail, and ghettos, and then authorizes discriminations against them in voting, employment, housing, education, and public benefits and jury services. The federal court system has effectively immunize the current system from challenges on the grounds of racial bias, such as earlier systems of control were protected and endorsed. By the U.S. Supreme Court. The parallel do not end there. However, mass incarceration like Jim Crow helps to define the meaning and significance of race in America. Indeed, the stigma of criminatory functions significance of race in America. Indeed, the stigma of criminally functions is much the same way that the stigma of racial once did. Okay. It justifies a legal, social, and economical boundary between us and them. Chapter 5 also explores some of the difference among slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. Most significantly, the fact that mass incarceration is designed to warehouse population demanded disposable, unnecessary to the functioning of the new global economy. While earlier systems of control were designed to give me 1 second. Were designed to exploit the control of black labor. In addition, the chapter discusses the experiences of white people in the new caste system. Although they have not been the primary targets of drug war, they have been harmed by it. A powerful illustration is how a racial state can harm people of all colors. Finally, the chapter responds to the skeptics who claim that massive incarceration cannot be understood as racial caste system because many get tough on crimes. Policies are supported by African Americans. Many of these claims I note are no more persuasive today in the argument made 100 years ago by blacks and whites who claim that racial segregation simply reflects reality, not racial immunities, and that African Americans would be better off not challenging the Jim Crow system, but should focus instead on improving themselves within it. Throughout our history, there have been African Americans who, for various reasons, have defended and been complacent complacent with the prevailing system of control. So basically what they're saying is we need to change instead of changing Jim Crow. And to an extent, we have to be aware of this new Jim Crow law and stop doing stupid stuff out there, even though, it targets us. Chapter 6 reflects on what acknowledges the presence of Jim Crow means for the future of civil rights advocacy. I argue that Nothing short of the major social movement can successfully dismantle the new caste system. Meaningful reforms can be achieved without such a movement, but unless the public consensus supporting the current system is completely overturned, the basic structure of the new caste system will remain intact. Building a new broad-based social movement, however, is not enough. It is not nearly enough to persuade mainstream voters that we have relied too heavily on incarceration or that drug abuse is a public health problem, not a crime. If the movement that emerges to challenge mass incarceration fails to confront squarely the critical role of race in the basic structure of our society, and if it fails to cultivate the ethnic of genuine care, compassion, and concern for every human being of every class, race, and nationality within our nation's borders, including poor whites who are often pitted against poor people of color. The collapse of mass incarceration will not mean the death of racial caste in America. Inevitably, the new system of racialized social control will emerge, one that we cannot foresee, just as the current system of mass incarceration was not predicted by anyone 30 years ago. No task is more urgent for racial justice. Come on now. Can't see nothing. Racial justice advocates today that assures that Americans' current racial caste system is its last. Okay, so that was just the introduction to that. I know that was long. Here's a couple people what they said about this book. So hope y'all understood a lot of that stuff in there, and you gotta understand that we are targeted, so we gotta be careful out there in the poor black communities. All right, thank you for listening. We get into the rest of this book later.